We all know that if you don't give plants sunlight, they die. But why is this the case? I mean, you can understand why plants need other things like soil and water for nutrients and space to grow. In this way, plants are like us. We need water and space, and instead of soil, we have food. But light? Plants need light because they are autotrophs, organisms that generate their own energy in the form of glucose. Organisms like us who cannot generate their own energies are called heterotrophs. You might be thinking, I make my own energy. It's not like I'm running on batteries to breathe. That's true, but in order to have energy to breathe and carry out our normal functions, we need to eat food. The foods we eat are complex organic substances that our bodies can break down to derive their nutrients. Plants, on the other hand, can act like their own solar panels. They can simply make energy with light energy from the sun. This is why you've never seen a flower chowing down a burger. The process by which plants convert solar energy into glucose, sugar that plants can then use to form energy, is called photosynthesis. This is the formula for photosynthesis, but we'll come back to this a little later when it hopefully will make more sense. Plant cells contain organelles called chloroplasts, the main sites of photosynthesis. Chloroplasts are filled with pigments, molecules that can absorb certain wavelengths of light and reflect or transmit other wavelengths. Among these pigments is chlorophyll, which absorbs violet, blue, and red rays but reflects green, which is why plants usually have a distinct green color. This is also why photosynthesis occurs in the green parts of the plant, which is typically around the leaves. If we refer back to the formula over here, we can see that on the reactant sides, we need water and carbon dioxide. Water enters the chloroplasts through leaf veins, while carbon dioxide enters through the stomata. Once water and carbon dioxide are in the chloroplasts, they should encounter the stroma, the semi-fluid interior of the chloroplasts, where carbon dioxide is reduced by enzymes to be a carbohydrate, which is basically a sugar. The thylakoids are stacked into these structures, collectively called the grana. Within the membranes of thylakoids are where pigments, such as chlorophyll, are actually kept. The lumen is the interior of the thylakoids, and you'll see why this is important in a little bit. Now, I said in the beginning that photosynthesis requires sunlight, but this is actually only somewhat true, because photosynthesis actually has two parts: the light-dependent reactions, for which you obviously need sunlight, and the Calvin cycle, which is also known as the light-independent reactions, since you actually don't need sunlight. The light-dependent reactions occur in the grana, while the Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma. Let's talk about the light-dependent reactions since it comes first. First, water is oxidized 2 molecules at a time, aka broken apart into 4 hydrogens and 2 oxygens. This is called photolysis, and 2 electrons are also released. Oxygen is a special element because it can only exist paired with another oxygen atom, so you'll never just see an O molecule naturally, you will see O2. This O2 molecule leaves the leaf into the atmosphere and becomes the oxygen molecules that you and I breathe in. Continuing on with the light-dependent reactions, the electrons released by photolysis enters photosystem 2. PS2 has a reaction center called P680, which absorbs wavelengths of 680 nanometers. P680 absorbs light particles called photons within this wavelength and uses these photons to excite electrons, meaning that the electrons have absorbed the extra energy coming from photons. In this state, electrons will rise and travel down the electron transport chain. What happens essentially is that electrons will pass through a series of protein complexes, and at each stop, the electron will give off some of its recently obtained energy. The electron will keep on losing energy until it goes back to its ground state. But how is any of this related to the plant making energy? Well, as the electrons give off energy through the ETC, this energy is actually used to pump hydrogen ions across the thylakoid membrane and into the lumen. Yep, remember the hydrogen atoms we got from splitting water molecules? We will now use these atoms, called ions because of their positive charge, and push them down their concentration gradient. And what is a concentration gradient? A concentration gradient is where there is a difference between the amount of a certain substance in one area versus another. In this case, we have a hydrogen ion gradient, since the lumen has much more hydrogen ions than the stroma. Atoms don't like being squished together, so they tend to flow down their concentration gradient, basically moving from an area where they are high in concentration to an area where there are not as many of them. Just like how when you see a crowded space, you tend to want to go the other way. Now, if someone were to force you to go through the crowded space from a non-crowded space, that would require energy. This is exactly what happens when we use the energy produced through the electron transport chain to push hydrogen ions against their concentration gradient and into the lumen. Electrons, which are now depleted of their energy, will enter PS1. PS1 has the reaction center P700 that absorbs photons with a wavelength of 700 nm, and we repeat the first process with PS2. Photons excite the electrons, causing them to go through another ETC. When the electron has reached the end of the ETC, it is transferred to a coenzyme called NADP+. NADP+ is called an electron carrier because it can carry electrons. When NADP+ gains an electron, it is reduced to become an NADPH. NADPH will transfer the electrons to the Calvin cycle in the stroma, which we will talk about later. Okay, I know all of this is a lot, but really quickly before we go, what was all that about with pumping hydrogen ions? Well, with so many hydrogen ions inside the thylakoid lumen, there is a lot of potential energy stored, since all of these molecules really want to escape. Remember, it's too crowded. So what happens is hydrogen ions will be pumped back out of the lumen using ATP synthase. This energy is used to combine an ADP and a phosphate molecule, forming an ATP molecule, and this entire process is called chemiosmosis. ATP is an energy molecule through which all organisms use whenever they need energy, so it is like the universal battery of biology. You might be thinking that all of this for just a few AT molecules? Is this even enough? You're right, this is not enough. This is why we need the Calvin cycle, which produces a lot more energy, and how this works? Find out next week.